So the title of this panel discussion is Our Partnership with Nature, Our Partners in Nature. And it's not, I think, even necessary to ask whether the animals that we view and around which much of our tourism efforts are centered are our partners, because they are. They are very clearly are. We've heard how people travel around the world and locally to view our animals. They are our partners, involuntarily so, but they are our partners in this endeavor. So I think we need to just probe that question a little bit. And let me start by asking Carol Berman. Carol Berman, you talked about how that you gave us data to show how the tourists can have negative effects, fairly predictable and not terribly surprising, but negative effects on macaque populations. Do you think that also, would you project that is also true for other primate groups? For example, the mountain gorillas that are a subject of tourism. Do you think if we measured it, there would be similar effects there?
Well, I think one of my main points is that we can't make assumptions, that we actually have to go and look and find out, because animals are very different. But I think that one of the things we should suspect is, yes, that we present something that's stressful for animals, and that the particular practices that we engage in when we're engaging in ecotourism have to be broken down and looked at separately, because some of them may be beneficial and some of them may not be. And I disagree with you that this was something that was obvious, because, for one thing, when I presented this to the staff of the ecotourism operation, they're not trained in biology, and their response was, "Oh, we're not killing the infants, they're killing the infants. It's not our fault, we have nothing to do with it." So, again, it might be obvious to some groups of people and not obvious to others.
Well, thank you. Thank you for both points. Number one, I hope all the students in the audience heard that there's opportunities for many, many future studies, and Dr. Berman just inspired you all to take each population. And number two, the word obvious may not have been the best choice. I myself made a comment yesterday that it may be ideal to just approach an animal that's in a state and leave the animal in the same state and presumably not bothering it. But there's increasing studies now that one can read that just the presence of humans may not produce an overt effect on the animal, but can result in an increased heart rate or increased cortisol levels, that the animal may be enhanced monitoring the presence of the human, and as a consequence of that. Bernard Jacobi, do you think similar things are true of the chimpanzees in Gombe, that the presence of tourists when they come by stress the chimpanzees?
Some of the human interactions with the animals, as I said yesterday, that they are very detrimental. And this is very clear, particularly when you deal with the unhabituated chimpanzee. You could find that what we call giving up density increases with the number, or rather with the increase of the interference from the human beings. What I mean is that a chimpanzee, for example, can leave a fruiting tree or a tree with fruit and forgo the fruits, even if she needs to eat, because she's nervous. And similarly, such interactions like feeding would have also negative consequences. For example, when the animals are fed with food brought from outside the national park, and which are not well screened, so they may bring in some virus, some bacteria, and which may cause some detrimental aspects to the animal. So in this case, what I mean is that dependent basically on the kind of interaction or the kind of tourism that is conducted within these natural habitats.
Is there a rule in Gambia on the maximum time that a tourist is allowed to stay with a group?
Of course, yes, there is a time set.
What is that time limit?
It's 1 hour.
Is it enforced?
Basically, that's one of the challenges that we're facing in the tourism arena, that the policies may be very clear, may be very well phrased, but implementation is basically a real problem. So
Is it 1 hour per group or 1 hour total time on those chimps per day?
is 1 hour per group of tourists. That's a maximum of 6. And after which another group can come in. So that means basically the welfare of the animal in this case is not considered should there be more than 1 group of tourists.
Do you think it should be lowered in your experience now?
Definitely, even the national park is coming up with some policies and has come up with a number, a limit, that there should be a maximum of 6 groups of 6 individuals per day. But
That would be 6 groups each an hour, so 6 hours per day?
6 hours of observation. But still, on the other hand, you find that the researchers, the researchers and the trackers, they're always following them up every single moment. So it may not be the logic, but you find that it has some effect if it is implemented to the rata.
Thank you. Terry Belke, you mentioned, you gave the example of the elk and how they are, essentially ubiquitous through the town. And I know many of us have been out west around elk. Many elk are town elk and seem not barely to react and seem to be quite compatible with human habitation. And I'm wondering, panelists, Terry or anyone, is it possible that in the future we would do well to focus on certain species and certain ecosystems that seem to be more human adapted and avoid those that are more stressed by our presence? Is there a possibility that our industry could self-regulate that way? There are some species that seem to be less impacted by the presence of tourists and the presence of people in general. Yes, no? Anyone want to answer that one? Anyone want to agree or disagree with me on that?
Well, it might be a good idea to start to lean towards that way. One of the things that we talked about yesterday were zoos as prisons, and because our zoo is so old, and I had an experience last week to be near some very large mammals, rhinos and elephants, it was sad to see them in that situation, but also I thought a lot about getting that connection when I was a young child. And I guess going back to the idea of the media, not getting that sort of connection through the media, seeing stuff in films and videos. Maybe it would be a good idea to go that direction. So if you have animals in a certain situation that are more tolerant to humans, you still are able to get that experience and still be able to get that inspiration from being that close to an animal. And if they're more tolerant of our presence, then there is less impact. And if we went in the direction that you're talking about, maybe that would kind of essentially take the heat off of the animals who are less tolerant.
I'm glad you mentioned zoos as an example. In the zoo world, we find that some animals adapt to captivity, adjust to captivity better than others. Others simply cannot thrive in captivity, at least the way we presently have it. Some do. And so zoos are leading towards species selection, favoring those animals that are compatible with their setup. And I'm asking the question about whether that's possible in the ecotourism business. David Fenner.
Yeah, I appreciated all the presentations, and I was just sort of bring up Carol's presentation at this stage of the game. For me, I thought with the level of intra-group competition that was taking place in that site where there was so much or not much density at all, or high density in a very small area, that seemed to me to be maybe worse conditions than we would find in a zoo environment because of the mortality the aggression and the mortality of the youngsters there. So that's something that struck me as I was listening to your presentation.
Right, and this particular species of macaque, more than any other species of macaque, eats structural plant parts as part of its diet. Others have higher quality diets, which means when it forages, it is probably more dispersed than other closely related species. So when it's put together in this kind of situation, it's probably more stressful for them than perhaps other macaques, which are also, very closely related to them. So you have to consider each species individually. And we now have better tools to look at some of these things. Instead of relying just on behavioral stress indicators, we can get cortisol now in the field from feces, even from saliva. I have a student in Indonesia now who is doing exactly that. She's looking at behavior and cortisol from saliva non-invasively. She gives them dental swabs. They chew them and spit them out, and she has the saliva to analyze. So, we're beginning to be able to approach some of these questions.
Natalie Roberts.
I just wanted to mention from personal experience in Churchill, which I will mention later. I refer to it as one of the best ecotourism experiences I've ever had, but it was also one of the worst, based on the different species that we observed. So our main purpose was to observe the belugas there, and that was the best ecotourism experience because the belugas actually approached us. Whether we were on a boat or kayaking or snorkeling, they would swim over to us, we could see them coming, and they would interact with us. And that was a very, very good experience. And the boat director even mentioned a phrase, if you remember, join them friendly, leave them friendly. So when the belugas come to us, they're presumably in a friendly mood, but then he leaves them so that we do not stay with them too long. But another instance, we came upon polar bears who were swimming, and we got very, very close to these animals, to the point that they kept looking back, they were breathing heavier, it seemed that they were swimming faster, and this was exactly the opposite of what his motto for the belugas was to me. When we were discussing later, we mentioned that this instance made us uncomfortable and upset, and even non-animal behavior majors or biology professors that were on the boat expressed these same feelings. So it really can be different, even with one ecotourism destination, even with one ecotourism company, between species and between how the interaction is played out.
That's an excellent point, and in fact, it's an answer to my question, so I thank you for that, which is for different species, there may be a more eco-tourist-friendly species, and as Carol Berman has been pointing out, we need to be very sophisticated in our approach and customize it to the species and maybe even to the individuals, reading the animals as they go. To answer me, everybody, panelists, about the issue of provisioning. In increasing instances, parks and tourist destinations are following the model of bird feeders. People have bird feeders in their yards to draw birds to their yards for their enjoyment of viewing them. And so there now I know there's a place in Germany where feed is put out to attract deer to come down from the mountains so that people can view. And Carol, your example of the macaques in China was a great one. There's some advantages because the animals, of course, are free to come or not, and the people are often confined into a viewing station so that they are not deciding the distance to the animal. The animal has a choice. But I wonder if you all have greater insights to this. And Carol, your opinion about this provisioning in China.
Well, clearly there are ways, thank you, of provisioning and ways of provisioning. The way they were doing it in China was really not sufficiently dispersed. Also, they only gave the animals corn, which is not a complete diet, and yet restricted their range. So I think there may have been some real nutritional deficiencies that these animals were compelled to have.
If done with a greater, if done the way you would design it, how would you feel about provisioning?
I would be very cautious because I think it often distorts the animal's movement patterns. It'll bring groups together, perhaps, that don't normally meet and don't normally compete over food. It could distort their reproductive patterns in ways that we really cannot predict. They might actually reproduce more frequently, but than they would under normal conditions. But we don't know the sort of ramifications down the road even to that.
That's a great, in fact, I guarantee you Elizabeth is saying, you're telling my, Elizabeth's talk for later is about that. Terry?
Yeah, that would, I agree. It seems like that's kind of treading the line towards altering behavior and taking in a lot of unwanted factors. One of the things I really loved about seeing the elk herds down in Pennsylvania, that was non-existent, and yet you still saw them everywhere. I mean, it was a very natural setting, and there was none of that at all. They kind of left it up to the herds themselves. And is that really necessary in an eco? Maybe that goes back to what we were talking about, and Harvey mentioned that yesterday, about expectations of the viewer too. Should that be a factor in ecotourism too, if we're really going to talk about, considering the animal welfare in particular?
Kelly, has TIES or any other organization taken a stand on that?
Yeah, I think there's actually, depending on species, and there's a lot of guidelines out there, and I think generally speaking, the recommendation is not to encourage or provision. However, I'm kind of challenged by that in certain situations. There's a couple of shark dives in Fiji that are actually done, apparently, they appear to be done very well. The researchers are kind of still out on what's happening.
Sharks are fed?
Where sharks are fed a very small amount.
That occurs off the coast of South Africa as well, right? They're
Yeah,
great
a
white
little bit
shark.
different there. They put them in cages, people in cages, and bring in great whites. But this is done a little bit different. And what the good things that it's done is it's created a new reef where the reef had died off. It's brought in dollars that directly benefit the community, so they've set aside this area as a marine sanctuary. And the plight of sharks is so disturbing right now that, anything that can be done to help people fight to help protect sharks, I think is a good thing. So I think it's a great opportunity for more research on that. They do know that some species only come by once every month or so, so how much are they habituated? I'm not sure, if they're stopping by every few weeks. There's some that are there all the time and sort of bottom feeders, so there's even a hierarchy within the species of sharks that are there, so.
This is great. David, are there any ethical implications, do you think, in provisioning?
Well, it was just, when Kelly was talking there, I teach a course called Tourism, Animals, and Ethics, and this last term, we had some student presentations. One of them was on diving with sharks, and they contrasted two operators, one that was provisioning, one was chumming. Basically, in order to get tourists to dive, you need sharks. So in order to get the sharks there, they were chumming. They were, chopping up smaller species of fish and throwing those in the water to get the sharks to come by.
Well, there's ethical implications right there for the fish that are
I
chum.
suppose so, yeah. And the other one, I guess there's new technologies out that you can attract sharks with sound, and in particular music. And the comment was that the sharks seem to like AC/DC more than some of the other bands out there. But
Who doesn't?
right. So I thought, just to answer your question, I think there are some ethical implications there, but yet there are some operators out there that are recognizing that and trying to change.
Well, one of
Right.
your major themes, and one that I so resonate with, is the animal should have a choice. And so when we're not disturbing the habitat at all and simply standing still, the animal can approach. I mean, it's the ideal ecotourism experience, isn't those rare cases like Natalie described, where the animal comes to you. If they were always like that, we would have a relatively short symposium saying, well, every time they come, we have a great experience and we've done no harm. But or we've done less harm. But where provisioning is often offered, at least in my experience, as close to that the animal still has that choice. I know that Carol was saying the choice is a choice that's somewhat framed by the human, but nevertheless. Elizabeth, you had a comment?
So while
Elizabeth George.
while Natalie and I can't speak as professionals on running ecotourism businesses or studying the ethics, we're kind of speaking as the ecotourist in this situation. And I think that from that perspective, the feeding kind of stations or provisioning does not really appeal to me. It feels like cheating in a way. And I would think that many people who travel to see animals, if they go all the way to the other side of the world, it's for the full experience and seeing the biology and the true nature of those animals, and not just seeing them, come out because someone, put food deliberately on the ground.
Great.
I think that brings us to a key question that has not been asked, is why are these animals being food conditioned? You use the term provision, I use food conditioning, because that's actually a legal term in wildlife management in North America, and it is illegal in many states and provinces to feed animals. So I think the question is, why are we doing this? I know why we're doing this. Your research on the macaque was not surprising, is that's almost a disruptive change in behavior. And to say that the animals are free to do this, it's not necessarily so, because you see with polar bear management is the cubs are trained to do this by their mothers. So your concept of free will really is already being changed, and the cub is being trained to go to that food source. And let me point out to somebody that lived in a community full of polar bears when the tourists are gone, who the hell is feeding the bears when the tourists are gone and when they're not enjoying it? Because that leaves a lot of problems for the local communities. And that's what people forget about this feeding. You talk about elks. Elks have spread brucellosis throughout Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba because people were feeding them, and they find them nice until they get problematic. That's always the issue. The research with food conditioning, yes, it is species specific, but it always seems to create a lot more problems, and it leaves a negative legacy. And that's one of the issues. And sometimes, who's going to feed these animals when the agency, when that year with SARS? So the animals aren't fed. So
This is great. It's a Brian.
Just to Harvey's point about why these animals are being conditioned in the way they are, I think it goes back to the self-interest thing in terms of people investing in spending their money, their hard-earned dollars to travel for these photographic opportunities, right? So there is research out there that says that tourists, even though they know these animals are being conditioned in certain ways, or even though they know that certain tourist sites are staged for this perception, for this experience of an authentic encounter, they don't care. They're motivated to get the picture, they're motivated to have that encounter. And that's not a universal experience for sure, but it's something that is certainly prevalent, that tourists are motivated not necessarily for the actual authentic encounter, but the perception of an authentic encounter.
Yeah, and that's such an excellent point. That is absolutely, I think, our observation. That's excellent. Thank you. We have a couple of questions from the audience, and one of them, Harvey, you or anyone want to comment on the ethical or moral downside of collecting insects? Because collecting mammals, of course, would be unacceptable. Collecting birds would be unacceptable. Harvey.
Well, I will point out, and I found this out from the birding world, that Audubon shot quite a few specimens and used them. So it was actually a practice, egg collecting. So there's been I hate to use the term an evolution, but a transformation of values within the birding world. And what we are seeing is that is being now applied to the insect world, and that's where it's creating conflicts. And unless we're discussing this, you're having a clash of interests. So birders don't like collecting in general. Entomologists like collection because often that's the first thing they do. And they're being challenged, and a lot of entomologists don't know how to deal with that because they feel that their scientific expertise is being challenged. It's not the expertise that's being challenged, it's the act of collecting. And that is not being well discussed. And what we find is when people are trained within entomology, it's a non-issue. Anybody else coming at it, including myself and my wife, it is an issue, and we need to talk about it because is it, for scientific purposes, I get it. For personal collections, to kill that many insects just so you can pin them up on your collection, by the way, dragonflies are really notorious for being hard to preserve. I have ethical issues because that is still a form of life.
Thank you.
So it does create a lot of conflict.
Tara Cornelius.
Thank you. I totally agree with Harvey that there is a clash and it's getting stronger, especially with the field of insect conservation becoming more prominent and insects declining in a much more dramatic way, and us discovering that. I think you maybe quoted 30% of the insects are declining. Some people even say 40. And so there is this clash. And then I also, from an education point of view, a lot of times when students take entomology, the entomologist professor wants them to make a collection. And so that's a very difficult thing for a lot of the students nowadays where it wasn't as much of an issue. So I think things are changing.
Excellent, thank you. One last question before we take our break, and this also comes from the audience. This is going back to the issue we discussed earlier about ecotourism and its benefit to the local community, and that there seemed to be a consensus in the panel that for the most part, that promise has not yet been achieved. The question asks, how would we know if the promise had been achieved? What level of employment or what level of economic benefit would be the target so that we can say ecotourism has done the benefit that it should? Surely it shouldn't be a promise of 100% employment. Surely it shouldn't be the promise of middle-class lifestyle for every citizen of a nation. That has to come from many sectors. What is success, Kennedy?
Well, I would look at it in terms of what is being earned in the first place. We may peg that percentage on the overall income. So if a lodge is generating, for example, $1,000 US, then we are taking back $200 US back to conservation, or maybe 300, and 500 goes back to the community because community is big and it involves many people. And the other percentage may be involved in other things. Maybe the government may take and may construct schools. So basically, if a community can be able to access, affordable health care, it can be able to take their kids to school. We are not talking about these communities having, building 5-story buildings or investing in EKIS activities. But we just want these communities to at least have a decent life. And we all understand what a decent life is. Having a good house, having enough to feed your family, taking your children to school, just the way anybody else is doing anywhere else, and they're doing business and they're earning.
Great, thank you. Thank you for these excellent questions and others that come from the audience.